417835. 417835. 417835. How many times do you think that I would need to say those numbers to you before you're able to remember it and retain it for the next, let's say, 3 or 4 months? I'll probably say it to you a few times today, maybe remind you tomorrow. Maybe at the end of the week, I would ask you again, what were the numbers 417835? And then I would remind you a couple weeks from now, and then maybe a month after that. And then by then, hopefully, you will be able to remember. But what if I had 40 of those numbers? Maybe if I had 100 of those numbers, how long would it take for me to repeat 100 different sequences of numbers to you, for you to be able to remember all 100 to at least, let's say, 90% retention 3 to 4 months from now? Probably quite a lot of times. And what we're talking about now is we're talking about spaced repetition. So what actually is spaced repetition? Spaced repetition is simply repeating a piece of information and revising it across a duration of time where in some cases, the duration increases each time. And this is a variation called expanding gap spaced repetition. So let's just draw what that looks like. This is a timeline. And let's say that we learn something right here. And this is the first time we learn a piece of information. Then spaced repetition would say that we should revise that material at the end of this week, and then again, and then again, and then again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Okay? And the idea is that by repeating this, having that repetition that is spaced out, it allows us to increase our retention. And there is quite a lot of research on spaced repetition, and we know that spaced repetition is effective. But the question is, how effective? And can we make it even more effective? So let's have a look at this a little bit more. Well, I mentioned expanding gap spaced repetition, and that's when instead of having it exactly the same distance apart, what we're doing instead is, let's say that we draw this again. We are doing it like this, where the gap between each repetition is getting longer and longer and longer each time. And what expanding gap spaced repetition does is it increases the chance for you to forget something, which means that when you revise it again, it's more likely to stick. So expanding gap spaced repetition is better than fixed spaced repetition. It increases your retention more and it's more effective. So that's one way that we can make spaced repetition more effective. However, spaced repetition has some serious limitations that I very, very rarely see being mentioned. Every single second and third year medical student out there is talking about spaced repetition and harping on like they just discovered their Lord and Savior, spaced repetition. However, it's not really the case, and it's not as simple as that. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So the first major factor is the method you use to actually revise during each point. So right now I've just represented these as these arrows, and it doesn't really describe what I'm doing at each of these points of spaced repetition. But the technique that I'm using to repeat it makes a really big difference. So for example, a technique that would produce a really low level of learning is simply rereading or rewriting the content. And this is because it's a form of learning which is called passive. Passive meaning that it's not engaging your brain and it's not creating a lot of learning in your brain. You might be doing a lot of stuff out here with your hands and reading a lot of stuff with your eyes, but when it comes down to the information sticking in your brain and cognitively the gears all turning, there's not a lot going on in there. You can do passive reading, which is when you're reading a page and you get to the bottom of it and you don't know what you even read. And you can do semi-passive reading, which is you're trying to pay attention, but you're still not trying to use the information in a particular way, which means that even though you're paying attention to what you're reading, because in your brain you're not taking that information and arranging and organizing it in an efficient way, it means that you're still not getting as much learning out of it as with highly active reading or highly active listening. So this method of just rereading and rewriting tends to be incredibly passive, and the only way to make it not passive is to be really, really attentive, which is also very energy consuming. So it's just overall not a very good way to do it. There are a lot of other techniques that you can use. The better version of that is something that a lot of people know about, which is called active recall. The active is talking about the fact that you are engaging your brain to bring about the process, and the recall is talking about the fact that you are bringing the information out from your memory, and you're not relying on just reading it again. You are covering it up, or you're not looking at it in the first place at all, and then you're able to recall it. And we go into active recall a little bit more in another video as well. So this is a more effective way. So if you're using active recall on top of spaced repetition, that's even more effective. And this is the same thing that everyone else talks about. We already know this from the hundreds of other YouTube videos that are out there, from every other study guru that talks about this. But that's not where the story ends. In fact, that's really where the story begins, because there are a number of other techniques that are even more effective than just active recall. So for example, there is constructivist, let me do that again. Constructivist methods of learning and revising, which basically mean that it's not just active recall, it's active reconstruction, which is a level even beyond it, because it tests you not only on that specific piece of information, but it tests you on that piece of information in relation to other pieces of information. So you're able to revise on batches of information all at once, and your retention of each batch becomes greater because they're all related to each other, so your brain is less likely to forget it. We talk about this idea of information versus relational learning often in our videos on studying effectiveness, and this shift of perspective from information to relationships is one of the fundamental shifts of any highly efficient learner. So there are many techniques involved in this as well. You've got teaching, for example, which is a highly effective revision technique. But even within teaching, there are certain methods of teaching that use more of this constructivist tendency, in that it rearranges the information in a particular way. So just like how not all teachers teach as effectively, you, when you're teaching someone else, the way you teach actually has a difference in the amount of learning you get out of that process. So you can be teaching as a form of revision, and that can be significantly less effective than teaching it with another more specific technique. For example, using whole part whole as a framework, the whole part whole framework, which again is one of the things that we teach in our course. So this is one thing, is that the way you revise should be different each time. It should be varied, and it should be challenging, and it should use a lot of different types of learning, which is something that we call interleaving, which is basically you're not just studying the same thing, you're studying something from multiple different angles and multiple variations of it as well. Not having interleaving is one of the reasons why a lot of students will get to an exam having learned and studied a topic, yet they'll be given a curveball question and not be able to answer it. That's because that curveball is a variation of the concept of what they studied, and they didn't practice those variations, so they didn't have interleaving. So good revision strategy should be varied. It should have interleaving. It should be constructivist, or at the very least using active recall. So the way you revise makes a really big difference. But there's even more than that, which is that the amount you need to revise in order to retain the information at a certain point becomes unsustainable if you're constantly forgetting it in the first place. And so let me talk to you a little bit about the basis of spaced repetition, which is something called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve says that when you learn a new piece of information for the very first time, you straight away will start forgetting it, and you forget it rather quickly. And then if you were to revise that information again later, then the information is forgotten a little bit more slowly. And if you were to revise it again another time after that, the information is retained longer and you forget it even less slowly. But Ebbinghaus forgetting curves are for information that is purely memorized. It doesn't consider information that is learnt with a relationship priority. So the numbers that I gave you at the beginning of this video, those numbers exist in isolation. They're not relevant to you, they're not relevant to me, they're not relevant to anything. So to remember that is very difficult, and they follow the Ebbinghaus forgetting curves. You will forget it very quickly initially, and then a little bit slower, and then slower. So that's why spaced repetition works. However, what's even more effective is bypassing the need for spaced repetition in the first place by adjusting this forgetting curve. Because there are things that we can do that can make it so that the very first time you learn it, your forgetting is not at this rate, but instead you can forget it at this rate, which means that maybe 1 month later, your retention is still at 90% as opposed to, potentially 50 or less if you were to use it, if you were to use another technique that uses the information in isolation. So the most powerful thing that you can do is actually not even need to revise it because you didn't forget it to begin with, which seems like it's only possible if you're a genius, but actually it's very consistently doable for most students as long as you have at least a moderate level of intelligence. And most of you who are watching this that are even interested in studying techniques in the first place, I can guarantee that you have the minimum level of intelligence to do this. And the best part about it is that these techniques also work with people with learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD. This same fundamental theory holds true. It's just the way that our brains are programmed, and even if you have your own particular way of learning, if you build that way of learning on top of this as a foundation, your personal variation will become even more powerful because it's just the way the human brain tends to work. And in fact, not even just the human brain, but most brains work this way. So how do we modify the curve so that we forget things a lot slower and we retain it a lot longer? Well, the way that we do this is through relational priority learning, which we have a video on this that goes a lot more in depth, so make sure to check that out. But long story short, what it basically says is that instead of viewing information in isolation to itself, where you have bits of information that you're trying to rote learn through repetition, which naturally takes a lot of time. I mean, imagine doing 100 flashcards every single day on these sequences of numbers, where every single day you're adding, let's say, 10 or 20 flashcards more. Because of the fact that you're not able to clear away the flashcards from having memorized it, every single day you are growing in the number of flashcards you need to do. You need to do 100 on the first day. The next day you need to do 120 because you need to revise the previous day's one. Well, the next day you need to do 140 because you need to do the previous day's ones. And then the next day you need to do maybe 200 because you're having to repeat some of those multiple times in a single day. So it gets exponentially greater and greater, and then it starts soaking up so much of your time that you don't even have the time to do the spaced repetition in the first place, which obviously defeats the entire point. So the better thing to do is not need to revise as much or as often, where you can get away with doing a revision once at the end of the month, and that tops up your retention and keeps it going until the exams or when you do your past papers or whatever it is that you're doing. And the way that you do that is by not viewing information in isolation, but instead viewing information through relationships, which again I go through a lot more in the other videos, and this is the stuff that we teach in the course as well. So the idea here is that spaced repetition is an effective form of studying and revision if you're not using it at all. If you are using it, you probably already see some of the limitations, and the reason why you really only hear this being talked about by people that are really not studying much or haven't worked with a lot of students or are very early on in their studying careers is because they haven't realized one of the key limitations, which is that it's not sustainable long term. Having high levels of spaced repetition, relying on you having memorized and repeating information is in itself mathematically not scalable because you are constantly learning more every single day, which means that you're adding more and more work for you to do later on. And if you're barely able to keep up with what's happening on a day-to-day basis, how do you expect to keep up with that as well as having time to revise the last 3 months of stuff through spaced repetition every single week? The answer is that it doesn't work, which is why a lot of people find that spaced repetition, even expanding gap spaced repetition, doesn't work out well for them. The much more effective solution, which we have found works a lot better with our students, is modifying this graph so that you fundamentally don't need spaced repetition that much, and then you add expanding gap spaced repetition on top of that, but now it's at a much more manageable level because the amount you need to revise is a lot less. So expanding gap spaced repetition, if you're not using it at all, use it. You're going to find that it's effective. However, if you're already using it, you're likely to start experiencing some of the limitations that it features, and you'll be surprised at how much time that you can actually save additionally once you start moving away from that spaced repetition reliance. So your next step is going to be how to change your learning so that you are moving your forgetting curve up so that you're forgetting a lot less, and that is through relational priority learning. So make sure to check that video out. Hopefully this changed your view, or you learned a little bit about spaced repetition and the reality of how you can use it at a high level. And take this information, apply it, always practice it in your own studying. Let me know how you find it in the comments below. Share with your friends, leave it a like, and if you like our content, make sure to subscribe. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.